Hello, everyone. Welcome to this panel on endgame conventions for unconventional warfare, a hugely important and topical question across the world today. Technology has always had a complex relationship with warfare. Historically, it has made warfare more brutal, necessitating conventions, arms control conventions, parts of the Outer Space Treaty that regulate what states can do. But over the past couple of decades, there have been new challenges and newer technologies that have compelled not just multilateral, but also multi stakeholder action on thinking of conventions and governance frameworks that regulate not just the technology, but the complex ecosystem and framework of actors operating around this technology. Around emerging technologies. There is cyber and artificial intelligence and various new forms of technology that broadly what we could call unconventional warfare. And the excellent set of panelists today are going to speak about a variety of applications of these technologies that uh, uh, make this ecosystem possible. And we hope that towards the end of this panel, we will come up with some thoughts on how the multi-stakeholder and multilateral ecosystem looking to regulate it can possibly make some progress going forward. So we have an excellent set of panelists today, as I mentioned. To start off with, without any further ado, we have Philip Reiner, who is the CEO of the Institute for Security and Technology. And Philip has had vast experience across a multitude of sectors. But if I could ask Philip to quickly come in on what the private sector view in this ecosystem is and how that feeds into the technological developments that underpin this debate, just to set up this panel for us. Philip, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation. I think it's an absolutely critical set of issues that we're dealing with here. And in terms of trying to grapple with emergent emergent technologies, but not only in terms of their current form, but trying to think about what they're going to look like over time, right? So in the instance of autonomous weapons, for by way of example, often folks will fall back on conversations about drones, right? That is probably the most, the easiest to picture, the easiest to discuss. But what goes into this is a much more complicated mix of technologies. And when you begin to talk about the international regulatory initiative to try and regulate these sorts of systems, you're talking about systems that are primarily coming out of the private sector. And these systems are, as such, really driven by companies that are innovating at the edge of technology, and they're going to continue to do so, which means that it is a very quickly moving target. It is very difficult to look at, for instance, the data sets that drive for what might be a drone swarm and how it behaves, for instance. How do you actually put regulatory constraints on what a private sector entity may develop in putting that sort of capability forward? These are the kinds of things that really are difficult to say that aren't for military use, that there are elements in this ecosystem that are quite simply for recreational or for personal use or even just for industry. When you think about regulating these sorts of capabilities, it's the weaponization and removing of the human from the loop. It's these more discrete elements of these conversations. What I think is absolutely critical, though, is that these discussions have to involve the private sector actors from the outset. And this is typically one of the challenging elements of these discussions that you point back to. Those conventions over time in the past really have only been between governments and between international organizations and governments. Whereas in the situation we find ourselves today, the private sector drives the vast majority of the elements that goes into these systems, and they have to be a part of the discussion. Most of what they develop is dual use, which adds a layer of complexity to the regulatory actions that are being looked at that could potentially constrain really horrifying outcomes for these types of systems. One thing that I would note, from my perspective, in the time that I've spent at the Pentagon, the time that I've spent at the White House, and the time I've spent working in the private sector, I spent years working at Raytheon Company and run an institute today that works very closely with the private sector. Thinking about unconventional warfare is different in everyone's context. It's very different for the United States and our military to think about unconventional warfare vis-a-vis these types of systems. Unconventional warfare really has nothing to do with these sorts of technologies at the end of the day. It has a lot more to do with special forces, has a lot more to do with the role that they play in developing capabilities for partner nations and what have you. So when I think of these systems, what I really think of is these are conventional elements that are changing what's happening on the battlefield. As you noted in your opening, it's not the first time. Technologies are developed, they're deployed, they change the way that battle is conducted. And I think we have to adjust as necessary. Again, one other thing I would say about the role of the private sector here is these are systems that will proliferate in ways that are almost uncontrollable, even if you have regulatory constraints in place. And I think other panelists are going to speak to this a little bit. The fact of the matter is these are going to be in the hands of non-state actors. They're going to be in the hands of just about anybody who wants to put their hands on them, which makes this all that much more difficult to try and contain. Those are just some opening thoughts on the topic. Thank you again for allowing me to be here with you.
Thanks so much, Philip. I think that very useful set of insights, and also sets up nicely my next question to Kabir. Kabir Taneja, who is a fellow of the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation. He's done a lot of recent writing on another set of non-state actors that have been involved both in South Asia and elsewhere, in particular with something that's been in the news recently about the drone attack in Jammu and Kashmir. So Kabir, just to some opening thoughts on what exactly is the role of course, there's the private sector as one non-state actor. What about other groups that are coming in and shaping this ecosystem, not just in our part of the world, but in other parts as well? Over to you, Kabir.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, it's the attack that happened in Jammu and Kashmir in July was sort of like one of these first events that take place that a lot of people have been talking about. A lot of people have been highlighting that this is a sort of new and evolved threat that is in the hands of non-state actors now, that the non-state actors and non-state militant actors specifically are able to access to, Jammu and Kashmir is a state that always has had a ripe environment for this kind of proliferation to take place. You see, the line of control is a very, very sort of fluid geography. If people are able to move in and out of that geography, then technologies such as drones, for example, operated by non-state militant actors, are going to in one way or the other find their way into an operational environment for the said militant organizations, and that's what happened in July. The interesting part is that, of course, what happened in Kashmir and the kind of just the kind of debate it created was not the first time that a drone was used in India in such a sort of conflict environment. It was actually first used, or at least reportedly used, by the far left Maoist insurgency in India as a surveillance tool, and not necessarily to drop IEDs or other sort of do-it-yourself weaponizations of the drone, but it was used as a surveillance tool to surveil bases of the Central Reserve Police Force, which is tasked to fight against the far left insurgency in the Indian state of Chhattisgarh. So that was the first instance, and that ideally should have been the red flag in Indian thinking, that this has finally arrived in the military ecosystems in South Asia. And it's a very interesting debate, because if you're talking about regulations or a governmental response to these kind of threats, I have a very fundamental question on that. Is, if ever, in heavy bureaucratic systems such as India, or even other countries in Europe, or at some level even the US, can policy ever catch up with technological threats and the evolution of technological threats? By the time we devise a regulation framework, the framework of that non-state militant actor using a said technology has moved multiple paces. And we saw this with the Indian sort of framework on how to regulate the drone area. So we are still only talking about at what at what height a drone is allowed to fly. Within that regulatory framework, and I'm sure that's not something that a non-state militant actor is going to abide by when operating in a theater like Kashmir or even with the far left insurgencies in other states of India. So it's a very these are very fundamental sort of questions. Can policy actually keep up with technological innovation? And the answer in my head is usually no. Then what are the alternatives? Then how do you counter these threats? So, for example, very quickly, India's response to what happened in Jammu and Kashmir was to devise systems within existing artillery that is deployed in the war zone or in the conflict zone to try and have a counter to drones and drones that are able to drop IEDs, and the artillery that is being sort of modded to this aspect is from the World War II era. So, it's not built anywhere remotely near to what kind of technology is being applied by non-state actors today and what is in the armory of conventional warfare armies, and not necessarily, in the US, which has an expansive use of military across the world, but more such as the Indian armed forces that are very sort of regional specific. And how are you going to sort of keep up with technological innovation, which is now in hands of non-state actors as well? So these are just sort of fundamental questions that come across from the Indian experience, and I'll just leave my opening comments at that, and happy to take questions later.
Thanks, Kabir. I think a couple of insights coming both from your and Philip's interventions. And I think the big question that you asked explicitly was, will we always be fighting the last, or as regulators, will we always be fighting the last war? Can technology ever catch up? And of course, there are two different sets of, as I mentioned, non-state actors here. Private sector, of course, they have a stake in shaping the debate, but the militant groups you refer to, how do we ensure that they are subject to and abide by whatever regulations do come about? And of course, that's been a challenge even with traditional legal systems like international humanitarian law, so on and so forth. But great opening half of this panel. Over to Pavel Koshkin, who is a senior research fellow at the Russian Academy of Sciences. And he's going to, I would request him to talk about a different kind of unconventional warfare using similar technologies, which is on deepfakes and how they are shaping this ecosystem and what potentially we can start thinking about when we talk about regulating deepfakes. Pavel, over to you. Thank you.
First of all, there is a lack of understanding and of how to use and control deepfakes today. Actually, a lot of Russian experts maybe just they underestimate the threat of using deepfakes in a warfare, even though it does exist actually, and because of they do not understand how it could be used. But on the other hand, there is another group of maybe just people who believe that just there is a concept, maybe you probably know it, the so-called low probability, high impact, just theory, let's say. Even though deepfakes, just the probability of using deepfakes, not so likely, but still, if it's used, the impact might be devastating. For example, it might cause a war between two countries. The problem is that the counter argument that people can detect them easily, just depending on your level of knowledge of this problem, and we cannot predict how people are aware about these technologies. For example, elsewhere, we can just talk about maybe a specific country, a specific group of people, maybe highly educated, but what about the rest of the and that's why we can see that there is a trend, there is a split, maybe just in the discourse. Some people do believe that it is a threat. Some people, just argue that it's an exaggeration, like a fantastic, scenario of a movie from James Cameron, like Terminator, The Judgment Day, something like this. But this is a problem actually, the lack of understanding and underestimation of this problem. And another problem there is, if you're just talking about deepfakes globally, how to regulate them, how to control them, and just, prevent the usage of these technical devices, let's say. There is a differences in legislation, national, among different countries. And as long as we have a lot of countries who have to come up with a compromise and a lot of legislation, just might result in high level of bureaucracy. We just talked about this previously, but if you talk about a specific bureaucracy in every country, this creates an additional problem and an obstacle. And not to mention the political distrust and confrontation between different kind of countries. It also let's say don't give you an optimism. Let's say you become less optimistic because of this fact, and the less of political will. Let's say the less of political will within the countries generally. Not the desire. I think everybody wanna cooperate on such important issues. Just politically, but the desire is not enough. We do need, let's say, the political will. But the political will, is impossible given the bureaucracy, the different groups of interest within the country. There always will be pro and contras of certain decisions, and so. This is how I would like maybe just to highlight this problem, actually, not only in Russia, but globally and elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Pavel. I think, again, some great insights on the different, notions of unconventional warfare, but also picking up on some themes that the panelists before spoke as well about national regulation becoming important and bureaucratic hurdles in getting there as well. And finally, last but by no means the least, Elsa, who is the Adjunct Senior Fellow of the Center for New American Society, Center for New American Security. She's done a lot of writing on different aspects of this topic. But if I could ask you to weigh in, Elsa, on how both countries with traditional military capabilities and other countries, how are they weighing into this debate, both in terms of technological innovation, and how is that feeding into the global negotiations on this space, of course, which you've done a lot of fantastic writing on. Elsa, over to you.
Thank you. Very, very glad to be joining the conversation, and I'm afraid that I may provide a pessimistic perspective on some fronts as well at this point. And I guess this is definitely a challenging conversation because we are talking about technologies that encompass so many potential applications and capabilities, and where traditional notions of arms control are really thwarted by the reality that often innovation, whether in the US, India, China, or Russia, is being driven very much by commercial enterprises that have their own interests and their own incentives in the developments that they're pursuing. So I guess I'll start by saying that I am definitely daunted by the challenges that I think states and companies will face on these fronts. And I think definitely we can look at anything from deepfakes, as we just heard, where there have been quite disparate national approaches. China, for instance, has been very aggressively responding to initial incidents where deepfakes were proliferating on social media, more for fun and entertainment than anything nefarious in that case. But definitely the Chinese authorities decided to respond relatively preemptively and starting to ban deepfakes outright or making their publication a criminal offense. That was a very sort of early aggressive approach relative to many states that haven't yet introduced sort of a formal framework to address that topic. And if we look at the other end of the spectrum, from digital to the physical world, as drones came up quite a bit earlier in the conversation, I think the challenge there is that beyond the drones that have been in use by major militaries for decades at this point, increasingly there are more and more commercial capabilities that you can buy on Amazon that you or me or someone from ISIS or any militant group can readily access. And Chinese companies like DJI have been certainly at the forefront of developing very cheap, affordable, and capable drones. And whether you want to take photos at a party or attach an explosive to one or stalk somebody in their neighborhood, there's definitely a lot of lot of troubling dynamics. And although I'm somebody who's focused more in my own research on how major militaries are struggling to innovate and are trying to keep pace with the opportunities and challenges that come with these new technologies, I think we have seen and will continue to recognize that often non-state actors are more creative and devious in their thinking on potential applications, and they are not constrained by the same bureaucracy or procurement regulations or requirements that many major militaries have had to fight to start to achieve some progress. And I think there's definitely a flexibility that can come the private sector and groups that are more unconventional and how they start to employ these technologies in ways that I think will only worsen as we see sort of drones becoming not just remotely piloted. And as somebody who once tried to pilot a drone and probably crashed it into a tree, I think definitely there is some skill involved, but definitely the skill required will lessen as there is more autonomy and options for greater programming and autonomous capability that is, I think, becoming more and more not on the horizon, but feasible, whether in a commercial or context or within a military organization. And I think the demonstrations we've seen, again, both military and commercial, of swarming, of targeting by unmanned or remotely piloted or less piloted but human supervised weapon systems are definitely concerning in terms of the trend and trajectory and the pace at which that is occurring. I think that being said, we are still some ways from the killer robots of myth and science fiction, but I think definitely the fear of where our current trends may take us has been animating a lot of the debate within forums like the UN Group of Government Experts on Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems. And again, I will try to find some optimism eventually, but to start from more of a pessimistic outlook, I think a general observation as somebody who's tried to follow some of these talks, at least from time to time, and sat in on some of the sessions, is that unsurprisingly, major militaries who are in the room aren't willing to tie their hands. They may have concerns about the impacts of these weapon systems, including when it comes to crises or on strategic stability in the long term, or concerns of unintended escalation. But when there is so much uncertainty about what these capabilities could bring to bear and how much they may impact the future military balance, no military is willing to tie their hands or limit their options in terms of what can be pursued in terms of research and development. At one point, China, for instance, appeared, I believe this was circa 2019, though the years have all run together since COVID, or no, I think as early as 2018, China had notionally put forward a proposal or a statement claiming to want to limit or ban the use of fully autonomous lethal weapon systems, but there was definitely a fair amount of confusion or perhaps deliberate ambiguity at the time, because there's no consensus definition or necessarily a single capability that illustrates what a fully autonomous weapon system would be, and that in and of itself is a tricky legal and policy question of sort of what fully autonomous means in this context. And there's definitely a difference between notional support for a ban on the use of a capability, either in general or in a certain context, or even in a certain geography that may be very, very, very complex or have a higher risk of accidents given civilian traffic, relative to sort of a parallel commitment to pursuing development and exploring what is possible as the technologies advance. So I think we can continue to expect that the progress through some of these usual settings for negotiations will be limited, but I think it has been really fascinating to see the engagement of civil society as well, and the ways in which both activists and companies are placing pressures on governments to be more specific and concrete in their commitments, and really bringing concerns about safety and security into the conversation. And to end on a note that is hopeful, I think at the end of the day, any military that is professional and that is preparing to fight more of a conventional operation does not want weapon systems that are unsafe, dangerous, and unlikely to perform as anticipated. there may be different levels of tolerance for risk or possibility of failure. And then, of course, there are different militaries that are looking to fight much more unconventionally, or that are non-state actors that don't care at all about safety or risk or possibility of an accident that could have deadly consequences. But I think there is some possibility for productive engagement among major militaries that are involved in developing these systems, and what are pragmatic measures by which to reduce risk and think about safety and ensure that there is attention to ethics and the laws of armed conflict being incorporated into the design process and going forward, whether that is in official diplomacy or track 2 and other more informal dialogues and discussions. I think there are some reasons for hope that there are ways to anticipate and mitigate worst case scenarios at the very least going forward.
Thanks, Elsa. A number of great insights there, but I think one key point that was that she raised that applies not just to the debate on autonomous weapon systems, but also on other newer forms of warfare, such as the development of offensive cyber capabilities, is this gap between countries appreciating what their capabilities are and the constraints that they would want to impose upon themselves, whether legal or otherwise, at legal fora, and whether the constraints would prevent innovation. I think that is a challenge that we will be dealing with across legal and governance regimes globally. So if I can turn back to Philip, and this is a question that I hope everyone can weigh in, is, of course, you referred in your opening remarks about how we are trying to apply traditional governance regimes on drones or otherwise to newer forms of warfare. But I wanted to ask you a normative question on what are the governance principles that you think can apply, whether it is we have a whole wide array of AI governance principles from a variety of both private sector organizations and civil society and some governments as well. We have international humanitarian law. What are the governance principles that you think can apply as we start thinking about regulating or continue thinking about regulating newer forms of technologies in warfare?
I think this is where it gets incredibly complicated, right? Because if you look at what Elsa was just talking about in terms of how militaries are going to be approaching this, at least from where I sit, right? Like, having spent time in the US government, having spent time at the Pentagon, our interests might be in developing these systems in a way that actually adhere to a certain set of ethics and the principles that you were just talking about. But there is no guarantee that the adversary is going to do the same thing, even when stated. And if we look at history, even the conventions that are in place with chemical weapons and what have you, those get violated with almost no consequence. So at the end of the day, it's incredibly difficult for those who are having to do this planning and think about international conventions that potentially could be adhered to in this space. I think, you look at the US DoD, they have their set of AI principles, which are not to just be kind of shunted aside. These are very serious people doing very serious things with these principles and trying to integrate them across the DoD efforts that are looking at machine learning and AI and implementing them. It is something they take very seriously, but at the end of the day, I think it's incredibly difficult to imagine a scenario where, for instance, you were to put that into some sort of international regime that everyone is adhering to, committed to, and then proving it. That is near impossible, right? So if you have, for instance, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you have the regimes that are in place in order to look at and verify adherence to commitments, it's quite tangible. For the most part, it's doable. For the most part, you can put systems in place to track materials, track delivery vehicles, hold people to account for any violations, etc. We're talking about systems that are not trackable, that are not something that can be verified, that are not something that, if at the moment of, as soon as you show someone how it actually is functioning to verify that you haven't done something you're not supposed to, you've shown them something they can take advantage of. It isn't the same thing at all. I think to your question, though, and I would love to hear what others have to say about this too, of course there are elements like the laws of armed conflict, the Geneva Convention. These are just as applicable to these systems as they are to any other military system. Whether a human is in the loop with one of these lethal autonomous systems or not, governments are going to have to work together to ensure that these capabilities are constrained within those conventions, just like any other weapon of war. There are going to be outliers who betray those principles, probably on a routine basis. It does little to constrain non-state actors like Daesh. They don't care, right? That's when you have to get into the conversations about proliferation and actually making sure that these things are a little bit more difficult to develop, deploy, but it may be a little bit easier to defend against. So you've got common capabilities that are better deployed so that you can actually knock these things out of the sky, for instance. But at the core of it, I really do think that the adoption of conventions around autonomous systems is going to be incredibly difficult. That does not obviate, however, existing things like the laws of armed conflict. I think they will be just as applicable.
Thanks, Philip. If I can turn the same question over to Kabir, and taking from an insight that Philip shared about the fact that adversaries, militant groups, even this is a problem even with the traditional application of the laws of armed conflict, don't comply with the same obligations, and they are not traditionally, not subjects of international law, or at least even if they are, they don't want to be. So then, what is, as states, what is the way to engage with them, and particularly with perspectives from this region? If the states constrain their capabilities, then does that mean that the non-state actors get an unfair advantage and threaten national security? What is your overall take?
Yeah, like Philip said, that's an incredibly complicated question to give any sort of wholesome answer around. It's, if you see it from the international order or international norms point of view, right? I think it's very critical whether its applicability is as effective as previous similar sort of global frameworks or not. That there are frameworks, there are debates, and there are discussions amongst states, whether it be through the United Nations or any other such similar sort of multilateral system, on how to go forward on these issues. This includes how non-state actors are going to use technology that we may actually not be able to regulate or control. But that does not mean that there is a vibrant debate on what are the best ways to try and manage the situations. Right. So I think that's something that, especially amongst like-minded countries, countries with strong sort of commitments to international order and strong commitments to non-proliferation, for example. There are going to be outliers, as Philip said. North Korea is a great example of that. They have a very robust sort of cyber, hacking systems and capabilities, considering it's a hermit state. And that shows that at some level it is a fairly low cost option for states to bring these kind of options of warfare within their sort of ecosystem without having to spend on ICBMs or much more expensive armaments and weapon systems. And of course, a lot of our sort of regulatory frameworks, when we're talking about warfare, come from these kind of systems that were physically large. They cost billions of dollars, and technology was slightly more easier to control at that point of time than what it is at this point of time. One of the great examples, when Elsa was talking about the drones being so sort of accessible, it was there was a report a couple of years back, or maybe 2-3 years back, about a quadcopter that was modded to drop IEDs either in Iraq or Syria by the Islamic State. I can't remember exactly where, but it was actually bought in India, activated in the UK, and dismantled, and somehow ended up being operated in a theater of conflict where Daesh was operating. Right, and I'm pretty sure, like as I said, this could have been bought at Toys R Us. It was a quadcopter, right? It's something that you would film a wedding with, or something similar. And it's very difficult to regulate these kind of products. You can't regulate that kind of technology, which is not meant for warfare, but is sort of co-opted by state and non-state actors alike for warfare capabilities. And that will not stop technological innovation. These kind of sort of proliferation is not going to dissuade technological movement, which which brings us to the policy part. Is that what can the international order, what can the regulatory order, what can laws do to try and combat this? And I think we need to slightly move the conversation away from trying to control to manage, because that's the best you can do when it comes to technological proliferation. Because there is no absolute answer here, and we can have as many debates as we want, and it's not going to come to a very satisfactory conclusion.
Control, not manage, is, I think, a great way to sum up a very useful set of insights. Pavel, same question for you. You spoke about deepfakes in your previous intervention, but is there scope for global cooperation, and what governance mechanisms could potentially apply to newer forms of unconventional warfare?
I guess the cooperation to fight or tackle deepfakes, the threat of using deepfakes, is possible within the UN actually framework. UN actually just proved itself as comparably comparably and just effective in some cases. And after all, just the United Nations, I think, can bring together Russia, the United States, China, India, and other countries. But the problem is to find, just to come up, to bring together IT experts, journalists, just political experts, politicians together, because, just every representative of a specific, profession have a different thinking of how to deal with the problem. And the problem is to come up with a common understanding between different, just specializations, different professions. And just responding maybe just to the previous questions about the specific examples of deepfakes, I want to just add, for example, if we just talked previously about the Islamic State, just two speakers just mentioned the Islamic State. For example, if you just imagine the situation when the Islamic State just using a deepfake, for example, a video depicting American president just, burning Quran, let's say, it might result a wave of anti-Americanism in the Middle East. And it might this is a real threat, actually. Just, for example, just in case of Russia, we have a very, high, not high population, but about maybe just 16%, or just the high level of, this threat regarding the Muslim population, for example. And such issues, such problems should be addressed specifically within the UN, such, just institutions, within the global governance. And only within the UN, I think it's possible to cooperate. For Russia, the United States, China, these countries, they just, see each other as rivals. Just Russia and the United States, or China and the United States. And we have to find such a platform, and the United Nations might be such a platform, might be. Not will be, but might be, let's say.
Thanks, Pavel. It might be indeed. Elsa, so is there any scope for optimism with the application of governance frameworks? Can the United Nations be a cause for optimism? Or should we leave this panel with a note of pessimism and say that we won't be actually devising conventions for unconventional warfare in the near future?
Let's see. So I will try to mix optimism and pessimism as best I can in closing, since I know we are very near the end of our time. But yeah, I think that the UN is a really critical forum to have these conversations in a manner that is inclusive of a range of countries with different perspectives and a series of different concerns and considerations on these issues. But I also think that beyond that, there need to be different bilateral and multilateral conversations going on as well, especially where drones or different applications of artificial intelligence may have major impacts on crisis management or strategic stability among great powers, whether that is between the US and China, or US and Russia, or India and Pakistan. I think it's really critical to augment the conversations happening within forums like the United Nations, which can be very slow and deliberative by design and are critical, but not necessarily quick or responsive to the pace of change, to augment those with both formal and informal diplomatic initiatives that try to focus on specific risks in regional contexts, and or are organized around particular themes or concerns like deepfakes in more of an in the international information environment. So I think there need to be, so just as there are a range of problems, I think there need to be a range of mechanisms and frameworks and forums for discourse on these issues. And I think there will never be any single law or treaty or policy or solution. I think that those who are looking to manage the problems that come with technological transformation have to be as creative in their efforts as those who are looking in trying to assure the safe use of these technologies for good, as those who are looking to use them for ill have demonstrated themselves to be so far. So I think creativity and flexibility will be really vital going forward. And I'll close with that.
Excellent. Thank you. Again, a great set of insights. So we have 2 minutes left. Rather than me summing up, why don't I turn it over to each of the panelists in 30 seconds? What, for the listeners, there have been so many different topics covered. What would be one key takeaway that you would definitely want them to leave here with? Philip, starting with you.
I'll inject one thing because I like to be contrarian. You have to imagine a world in which lethal autonomous weapon systems are normal, that they're here, and that we've been living in a world with them for quite some time. You have to imagine a world in which, hark back to when nuclear weapons were used, hark back to when chemical weapons were used. The horrifying nature of the impact of those types of weapons are what resulted in those conventions that now constrain them. Perhaps it's when we live in a world with lethal autonomous weapon systems that we see what the damage really could be, and then we actually see international conventions put in place. Perhaps that's where we're going to have to end up.
Yeah, look, as my co-panelist just said, that autonomous weapons are here, and they have been like in practice now at a significant level. Iran was a great example recently on the assassination of one of the nuclear scientists. And I will despite my own pessimisms about the United Nations, I will echo what Pavel was saying, that it still remains a significant platform for these discussions to take place in a very wholesome manner, despite an erosion of confidence of what the UN sort of ends up achieving. But I think it is our best bet to bring as many interested parties together as we can, especially around the UNGA, to start having a more robust discussions about where this is heading, how best to manage it, and what kind of capacities can be built within international legal systems to make sure the fallouts are minimal.
Thank you. Pavel, key takeaway.
I just want to quote one very famous statement: "Hope for the best, but be ready for the worst." I think this could be applied to everything we just talked previously. Hoping for the best, but be ready for the worst. I think this is the only, not only, but a good tactic of understanding all these problems, and at the same time, just not to overreact, just not to exaggerate, just to be realistic in our assessments.
Simple but effective. Thank you. Elsa.
I guess I'd say simply, I think as human beings in this complex world, as citizens of our respective countries, and as professionals who think about foreign policy and national security, we have to continue to educate ourselves about the impacts of technology. And I think that is a lifelong endeavor of learning and education and trying to understand the world as it changes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It was my absolute privilege and honor to moderate this panel today. And thankfully, the panelists did the job of summing up for you. So I'm going to just draw from their points on the notions of normalcy, on the potentials of the UN, on hoping for the best, but expecting the worst, and the importance of continuous education in this field. But there were so many other themes that we covered, and I would encourage you to also look at the great scholarship and work that all 4 panelists have produced. It definitely helped inform my understanding of the subject, and I'm sure it will inform your understanding of a subject that is very, very complex, very difficult to answer, but will become one of, and already has become, possibly the most important subject in terms of global governance of conflict today. Thank you very much to the team at ORF for organizing this and having all of us on. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Take
Thank you,
care.
everyone.